Welcome to College Talks Case Studies. We are here today. My name is Carrie Hanrahan. I am the Director of College Advising here at LogicPrep, and I'm excited to introduce you to this College Talks where our college advisors, Marjorie and Olivia, are going to share redacted student applications from previous cycles and demystify why each of these students were accepted, what an application itself entails, and the strategy behind all of it. So thank you so much for joining us. Again, my name is Carrie, and I'm going to pass this off to Marjorie.
Thank you, Carrie. Welcome, everybody. It's so nice to see so many of you joining us. We really appreciate you coming out tonight. And we know some of you are here in the United States. Others of you are joining us from other continents. I'll just briefly introduce myself. I started out in college admissions at Duke University after I graduated, worked there for about 4 years, and my territory, so to speak, was the New York state in its entirety. So I traveled both in New York City and out on Long Island throughout Westchester County, upstate New York. That's how I became very familiar with schools in the greater New York metro area. After working there for a period of time, I went back to graduate school at the University of Michigan, studied literature, and then waited for another great opportunity in higher ed administration to open up back in the Southeast, which was the part of the country nearest and dearest to my heart at that time. I became an admission dean at the University of Virginia. So most of my experiences both at Duke and UVA, and also having traveled with many admission representatives from other colleges. We participated in joint travel and that sort of thing. As my own family came into focus and I started spending more time with parents and their own children, I started to become more interested in the family side of the conversation around college admissions. And that is when I sought out an opportunity to work in the college advising side of the desk, so to speak. And I found LogicPrep and have been here ever since. So happy to answer questions later in the program, but that's a brief introduction. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Olivia.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marjorie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Olivia. I am also one of our advisors here at LogicPrep. My admission experience started while I was still in college. I participated as a admission interviewer during my time at Colorado College here in the beautiful state of Colorado. After graduating, moved up to Denver and worked at Regis University for several years, focusing a lot on our admissions marketing as well as recruitment of students. So from the slightly less selective side of things, which I think is a really beneficial experience to have. While I was there, also pursued a master's degree in marketing as well. And then from my experience at Regis, I later accepted a position as an assistant director at College of the Holy Cross, staying within the Jesuit college family. Holy Cross is in Massachusetts. However, I worked for them during the pandemic, so I stayed in Colorado and did all of my travel to New York City and many other parts of New York and the greater tri-state area virtually. I've also spent time recruiting international students and working with international students from a wide variety of countries during my time in admissions. And since then have recently joined LogicPrep as a full-time staff member, which I'm very excited about, so that I can really focus not only just on one college, but on any college that might be the right fit for the students I'm working with.
Thank you so much, Olivia. And with that, I'm really going to start our presentation, and Marjorie's going to kick this off with her student Cordelia, who got into the University of Virginia.
Thank you, Carrie. And while we're transitioning to our first case study of the evening, I'll just mention in advance so that you can sort of anticipate where we're headed, that I'm going to present one student and then Olivia will present one student, then back to me, then back to Olivia. So in total, you're going to be hearing about 4 students this evening. 2 of them are from what we would refer to as domestic applicants, students here in the United States, and 2 of them are applicants from abroad. And I'll let Olivia speak to those because for this evening, we've divided it up where I'm working on, or presenting, I should say, 2 New York-based students, and Olivia has 2 students from abroad. LogicPrep does provide college consulting services both in the United States and outside of the United States. This first student, Cordelia Lividini, and of course all names are redacted, and we've sought permission from families who were pleased to let us present aspects of their children's process in order to hopefully illuminate the selective college admission process for you all. So it's a pleasure to reflect back on Cordelia's process. And I tried to give a little bit of thought to where some of you might be in your lives, those of you who have children who are juniors in high school, for example. And I thought that maybe we would start just by revisiting aspects of Cordelia's process with LogicPrep and some of what occurred leading up to the process of applying to the University of Virginia and even deciding that that would ultimately be where she would apply for early decision. So Carrie, if you don't mind advancing the slides, that would be great. Thank you. So I thought perhaps we would start with spring of Cordelia's junior year, since I imagine that many of you are in or anticipating the spring of your own child's junior year. And I guess one message that I'd like to impart, or one observation that I would like to share, is that sometimes it's around this time of year or this time of a parent or a child's life where I think that there's some increased stress around the imminence of the college application process, and perhaps even an underlying feeling that, you know, we should be doing more. What should we be doing to organize ourselves for the college admission process? And I do want to provide reassurance and impart to you our feeling here at LogicPrep that it's really important that we, to the extent possible, really support students in just living their lives. That's what they should be doing junior year, focusing on their coursework, really taking advantage of all of the great learning opportunities available to them in their high school, which is their preparation for taking advantage of the learning opportunities in college. To the extent that there are things to be thinking about now, when I reflected back on my notes from conversations with Cordelia and her father, because in her case, her father was my primary contact for the parent side of things. In my other student, you're going to hear more about my contact with her mom, and that's different for every family. But looking back at my notes from this time of year, Cordelia was starting to think a little bit about strategizing for her AP exams. She was taking 4 APs in her junior year in US History, Art, Statistics, and Photography. She was talking about an internship where she could really hone some skills, and we can come back to those in a little while, and pursue her interests. She also had applied for a pre-college program at a very competitive Ivy League college, and she had already visited quite a few schools. Keep in mind, this student was pre-pandemic, and also she was the youngest of 3 siblings, so she had the benefit of tagging along. I'm finding that with many of my juniors, they really haven't had a lot of opportunity just yet to visit schools. We can talk later in the program about the proliferation of virtual resources that have been made available and that are a great starting point, and also that there is still plenty of time to research and even visit some colleges in person. She had a sibling at Bucknell and had determined, like, whatever else happens, I could be happy there. Looking ahead then to June, July, the summer before senior year, this is really the time of year where we try with our families and where we would encourage you to be thinking about how to bring the college list into focus. At this point in time, frankly, in the spring of junior year, there are actually still quite a few unknowns. For example, students don't really have their formal GPA or their cumulative GPA. They might still be in the process of preparing for standardized tests. They haven't yet taken all of the AP exams that they perhaps plan to take at the end of junior year. So it's really the summer right before senior year that some of those unknowns become known. And that's a good time to be ready to meet that moment, to start thinking a little bit more strategically about a college list. And so Cordelia had really been leaning toward the Southeast based on some of her visiting. She started to really hone in on Georgetown, also really liked UVA, had mentioned that to me a couple of times. And in italics here, you can see I've included a quote from my partner in working with Cordelia, who is or was Cordelia's essay coach. At LogicPrep, our model is that we have a college advisor and an essay coach supporting each of our students. And so when Cordelia's essay coach had first met with her, I just grabbed a quote. "I love Cordelia. She has great social skills, intriguing interests, including vintage cars, piano, app design." And this is really our part of our process of getting to know our students well, listening to their life stories, helping them to identify anecdotes and interesting life moments that might be good material for an essay. It really is June, July before senior year that we start encouraging students to really focus on their personal statement for college, starting with the personal statement that is developed typically for the Common Application, which is the platform where many colleges have organized themselves to facilitate and make it easy for students to apply to many colleges. And then looking ahead to late summer, early fall, we really try to think more strategically about early action and early decision. In Cordelia's case, she really had been leaning at one point toward Georgetown, but I'm sorry, I know Carrie wants me to advance to the next slide, but we started to actually feel like the Georgetown application was a bit of a chore. And when she turned her attention to early action at UVA, she started to really have fun with her supplemental essays. And we started to talk more seriously about the possibility of applying to UVA for early decision. This was the first year that UVA had offered early decision in addition to early action. And we sensed that strategically it could actually be a great year to get out there early. UVA's deadline was very early. It was an October 15th early decision deadline. And we talked many times about the pros and cons of Georgetown for what they referred to as restrictive early action versus UVA for early decision, and ultimately agreed that strategically we felt she would be better off with UVA. And we can come back to that later in the program if we end up discussing the various early action, early decision options. So that's a little bit about her journey. And now please do advance to the next slide. Sorry about that, Carrie. Thank you. So a little bit about Cordelia's academic credentials. I mentioned that at the end of junior year, some of those unknowns become knowns. So her overall cumulative GPA by the end of junior year was a 4.1. This is a student who was primarily an A student, a couple of A pluses, a couple of Bs and B pluses early on in her high school career. I think it was primarily ninth grade. When we talk about that GPA and when we are helping families to try to think strategically about building a college list, an important aspect or dimension of that conversation entails really trying to understand what the GPA means in the context of the school. So I imagine, you might have a feeling about a 4.1 GPA, and then maybe your feeling starts to change a little bit when you pause over the reality that 33% of seniors at this high school have a GPA between 4.0 and 4.6. So although many schools don't rank students or provide, even a decile rank or anything along those lines, this is information that is provided to colleges to help colleges get a sense of, what does it mean to have that 4.1? And in this case, it means that although this is a very high achieving student earning many A's, at her high school, there are also many high achieving students earning mostly A pluses or many A pluses, which is what ends up determining that a 4.1 is actually not at, as you can see, it's not at the tippy top of the graduating class. In addition, by the end of summer, looking to fall, this student had completed her standardized testing. She ended up with 2 AP scores of 4. You might remember she was taking 4 APs her junior year. This is also part of our conversation with families, is helping students to think carefully about what AP scores to report. And she was fortunate to be able to report 2 of 4. And this is back when subject tests were still in scope. As you know, for students in the United States, there are no SAT-2 tests available anymore. And for international students this year, there were. So this is a little bit about her academic profile. And again, trying to help you envision her as a very high achieving student, but a student where, from our perspective, she really would be doing herself a favor by identifying an early decision school potentially, where she could benefit from the statistical advantage that we see students having in early decision. I wanted to also just introduce here the importance of trying to leverage some of the more subjective application components. And here, just to focus for a minute on extracurricular activities, and I'll allow you to just take a minute to read through her activity list for yourself. But primarily here, I want to just speak to what I think is sometimes, again, a tension that starts to creep in around this time of year, where students and parents feel some pressure, either related to engaging in something that's incredibly novel, or ensuring that there's a sufficient number of activities to report when children apply to college. And here, I guess I'm just trying to illustrate for you, although obviously we're not taking pictures here of the application platform itself, but it is relevant here to point out that on the Common Application platform, which again is the platform, just the technological platform that students use for many, many colleges, the vast majority of colleges, there really are only 10 opportunities to report extracurricular activities. You've got 10 slots, and we help students to use these slots as strategically as possible. You can see off to the right, we're trying to help you visualize that continuity of commitment can be helpful to students. This is something that colleges can discern at a glance from the way that the information is laid out. And also to be thinking for your own child about what would the top 3 activities be? You know, we work in descending priority order. So very important to think about, like, as you're introducing yourself to the admissions officer or the evaluator reading the application, what do you most want them to know? So here it is safe to say that, you know, a lot of thought went into, for this student, field hockey, classical piano, and her internship at this car refurbisher. And you'll see, you know, then shortly thereafter, I wanted to make the point that number 4 here, student intro engineering. What is that about? So another question we often get from families around this time of year is, you know, how worthwhile is it to do a summer program, a pre-college summer program? And you'll remember from an earlier slide that Cordelia was applying and did choose to attend a pre-college program at a selective Ivy League college. Really, the extent to which that experience helps students depends largely on what they get out of the experience and how relevant it is for their overall narrative. Cordelia did end up applying to the School of Engineering at UVA, and for her, that summer program really did, it became influential in her overall narrative. So although we didn't feel we needed to hammer that in the extracurricular activities because it comes up later in the application, we did want to create an opportunity for her to articulate or provide more detail, more insight into the nature of the summer program that she did and why it was meaningful. So there would have been a description underlying this activity number 4. And even though it's only one summer of, you know, as you can see, many years of involvement in other things, you know, for this student, it was informing her overall narrative is sort of the way that I would describe it. I think that's really all that I had wanted to suggest about activities for the time being. And we can, of course, always come back to that if there are questions later. The other subjective application component that we hoped to illuminate for you this evening is, of course, the personal statement or the essays in general. And here we're just going to briefly detour to provide a roadmap for where we're headed, which is to say that, as I've mentioned, the Common Application is where so many of the colleges are set up for your children to apply to college. And the prompts for the Common App platform for the main personal essay don't tend to change a whole lot from year to year. So you could go out and Google the prompts for 2022, 2023. They will probably be made available anytime now, and they'll probably look a lot like what you see on this slide. Last year, I will point out that number 4, it was the 7th. There used to be 6, now there are 7th, but number 4 is new. Reflect on something that someone has done for you that made you happy or thankful in a surprising way. How has this gratitude affected or motivated you? I think this was sort of coming out of the pandemic in an effort to invite some positivity and provide an opportunity for students to reflect. For tonight, we're really going to focus on Essay 1 and Essay 3 because, as it turns out, both of the students I chose to talk about utilized essay prompt number 1, and both of the students that Olivia chose to present utilized essay number 3. So if I can ask you to go to the next slide, Carrie. Thank you. So Cordelia was writing about her background, identity, interest, or talent. And again, here, my hope is that what I'd like to impart to you about Cordelia's approach to her essay might be useful to you in thinking about how to guide your own child in writing his or her essay, or to provide some insight into how we approach the process. So here you can see I've tried to, provide a roadmap for where I'm headed. We talked a lot, Cordelia and I, about this interest that she had in vintage automobiles and this internship, this really fun internship that she had had the summer before senior year. So we started with something sort of, unexpected. You might not think I'm the person to have this passion for vintage automobiles. And then we thought it would be important to think a little bit about how a college admissions evaluator might feel about a student from Westchester County talking about vintage automobiles, and to be a little bit self-referential And to make the point that, my love of automobiles started with looking out the window, because you don't have to look very far to admire cars in Westchester County, sort of acknowledging, if you will, I'll use the term, the privilege, of applying from the high performing high school in the high performing region that this student is applying from. And then really just to make the point that we started with something very near and dear to this student's heart, kind of a quirky interest, and then thought about, thematically what could be helpful to her. And we developed a theme around gender, simply stated. My colleagues found it unusual that a young woman would want to work at a vintage car refurbisher. And then finally, what you see here in the last excerpt that we thought would be helpful to present is, you may have noticed in this student's extracurricular activities list that, she's been a cheerleader for 4 years. And this is also a conversation that we have with our students about what is the best way to address your cheerleading. Cheerleading is, it's an interesting activity to think about in this moment. And here, we really invited the student into reflection about how can she sort of square these various interests and convey to the evaluator what she loves about cheerleading and what has been rewarding to her. And then ultimately, down at the bottom, a personal unexpected connection where the head technician actually, as it turns out, had also been a cheerleader. This prompt doesn't work for everybody, but we do find that it can be a way to bolster confidence. I think some students, when they initially encounter this prompt, they think about background, identity, and interests as being these sort of monolithic, very serious things, their ethnic or racial identity, their religious identity, an academic interest, or a talent that is so well developed that, they could, they could be famous for the talent. And here, I guess what I hoped to illuminate, and also in Cordelia's extracurricular activities, is that, she's a great kid with interesting interests. And our hope is to help her make the best possible first impression that she could make on the evaluator by leveraging the more subjective application components. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Olivia to talk about our
Thank
next.
you.
Thank
Thank you, Marjorie. I really appreciate you kicking this off with Cordelia and explaining how the industry of college admissions is always growing and changing. I think if you all remember back to when Marjorie started this conversation, she said that Cordelia was interested in applying to Georgetown for quite a while and looking at, can she apply restrictive early action to Georgetown? Will that be beneficial to her specific, application and what she wants? And she was weighing Georgetown and UVA, and Marjorie was able to come in and say, the benefits of applying early decision at UVA in this first inaugural year of having early decision at UVA is going to really outweigh the benefits of applying restrictive early action to Georgetown. And since she was applying to both, she was thinking of both schools as a relatively equal, I would say on equal footing, she really worked with Marjorie to craft that strong application to University of Virginia over restrictive early action to Georgetown. So Marjorie, thank you so much. Did I capture that correctly?
Thank you. Yes, that was great.
Awesome.
Thank you, Carrie.
All right, thanks so much. Olivia, let's go to Lily Potter over here at Middlebury.
Yes, so let's talk about Lily. So Lily is a really wonderful student. If you want to advance and just start working on some of the slides here. My first question whenever I first meet with a student is always, who are you? What matters to you? What do I need to know about you? So that's where I decided to start in terms of presenting my students. So who is she? Lily is a Brazilian student. She lived in the US for 5 years during the end of elementary school and part of middle school, and then returned to Brazil in high school to attend an international school. So she has experience living in the US. She's very familiar. She was in the Northeast, so she's very familiar with that area and felt very comfortable with her decision to attend a US college. She's a pretty strong student academically. She's attending a school with a full IB curriculum. She had a mix of 5s, 6s, and 7s throughout her entire high school. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the IB, that's sort of an equivalent to a mostly A with a few Bs type student. And then had mid-range standardized test scores. So she scored, her highest SAT was a 1350, and then she had a really strong TOEFL at 112, which also makes sense having spent 5 years in the US speaking English. She's very competent with her English proficiency. I want to point out her HL courses that she decided to take specifically for her IB curriculum here. So this student is very interested in the liberal arts and sciences, in social science, in writing. So her HL courses really reflect those kinds of interests. She's chosen history, economics, and her language and literature course as her higher level courses for IB. And so the choices that you make in terms of your courses, whether that's through an IB curriculum or an AP curriculum, can really reflect your interests as a student and where you might choose to go in terms of a major or career when you get to the college process. So that's something that I wanted to show there as well. And then with her standardized test scores, she is sort of in the middle for a lot of colleges. And that's something that we'll talk about just a little bit more later of where she landed with her SATs. And then we'll take a quick look at Lily's extracurricular activities as well, because like Marjorie, I think it's important that you see a little more of a whole person here with Lily. So to get a sense of what she's been involved with during her time in high school, she was event coordinating and interning for a number of different social organizations and non-governmental organizations to basically help coordinate fundraising events and other types of things. So she's very involved with service, very involved with fundraising, both through her school and through her own time. She also had the opportunity in her senior year to intern with a law firm, which was a really cool opportunity for her as someone who is considering a career in law. So that was one of the pieces that was really important to put in her top 3 because it correlates well with a potential career interest that she's considering. And then you'll notice a variety down the list as well of different service organizations. She was very involved in writing in her school newspaper. She's been involved in Model UN. So a lot of things that really correlate well with the type of person that she is. So moving on from there, let's talk a little bit about what our conversations look like. So my first question for her really, once I feel like I get to know her a little bit, is what is she looking for? And so Lily primarily is looking for a small to medium-sized liberal arts focused college or university in the Northeast. As I mentioned, she lived in the Northeast for a while. She's familiar with the area. She loved the idea of a small liberal arts college or a mid-sized university. She's pretty open to either of those options. The largest school she ended up applying to actually was UVA, which is funny. And she also really wanted a place where she could enter as an undecided student because she wasn't sure exactly what she wanted to study. And that's where the liberal arts model can be really beneficial to you as a student because you don't have to know, and that's okay. And no one in the admission office is going to look at your application and maybe ding you or not want to admit you because you don't know what you want yet. That's part of the purpose of a liberal arts college or university, is to help you figure it out when you're there. But she knows she wants to focus on humanities and social sciences, so she was looking for a college that was really strong in those areas. And as I mentioned, she's also considering a career in law, so she wanted to find a place that would help set her up for that potential career path if she decided to pursue it. And then some of the really pivotal conversations that Lily and I had during our time working together. First and foremost, where will her testing be additive? And additive is a word that we use all the time in the college application process to mean that some aspect of your application will add value to your application. So when you think about optional things in the test in the application process, test scores have become optional almost everywhere at this point because of the pandemic. Middlebury has been test optional for a very long time. But what we ask ourselves and what we ask our students a lot of times is, will your test scores be additive? Will they add value to your application? And for Lily, having a 1350 SAT, she was very much in the middle, where her reach schools on her list, Middlebury included, she was a little bit below where I would want her to be for her testing to be additive. And how we figure this out is by using a metric called the middle 50%. Now, this is not an end all be all, but this is the general process that we use. So a middle 50% range tells you what the scores are of the students that submitted test scores to the college and were admitted from basically the lowest quarter of the students and then the highest quarter of the students. So for example, if you were to take Middlebury, let's say their test range, their middle 50% is a 1430 SAT to a 1480 SAT. That means that 75% of the students that submitted test scores to Middlebury and were accepted scored at least a 1430 on the SAT. And that also means that 25% of the students that were accepted to Middlebury submitting test scores scored at least a 1480 or higher. And so in places where, for example, Lily's SAT falls below that middle 50%, then it doesn't make sense for her necessarily to add those test scores to her application because it's stronger without them. Now, at some of the schools on her list, she was actually within the middle 50% or even above it. For some of her target or likely schools on her list. So in those cases, we did choose to submit her test scores. The second conversation we had was around the importance of writing in interviews, particularly for liberal arts colleges and universities, because they do place more weight on those less tangible parts of the application than some of the larger universities, which tend to be a bit more formulaic. So we talked a lot about the importance of her essays and preparing for interviews, which are very common among liberal arts colleges and universities. And then the last important conversation we had together was a last minute dilemma that she had around sticking with Middlebury or switching gears and deciding to apply early decision at Tufts. Middlebury was the first college that Lily talked to me about. It was one of the first that she got to know. It was sort of at the top of her list from the very first day that we worked together. But Tufts was also sort of always in the background for her as a place that she knew a lot about, that she was familiar with, and that she was intrigued by. And so this whole time we're working towards, she's applying ED to Middlebury, And all of a sudden at the beginning of October, Lily comes to me and says, I don't know if I want to apply to Middlebury. What if I want to apply to Tufts? So we had a very long, in-depth conversation about what would be the plus or minus of doing ED at Middlebury versus Tufts. So what are the things that Tufts can give you that Middlebury can't? And what are the things that Middlebury could give you that Tufts can't? And really what my role was there as her advisor was to just help her work through it and reflect on what she wanted. Because I was happy to support her application early decision to either school. And what I wanted was for her to be able to talk that through and figure out for herself where she was going to be most excited to potentially attend if she got accepted. And ultimately, she ended up going back to Middlebury, which was her initial hope for her early decision application. And then we'll talk just briefly about Lily's essay process as well. So as Marjorie mentioned, both of my students chose prompt number 3, which is about questioning or challenging a belief or idea. And I love the way that Lily wrote this essay because she is a very philosophical and introspective person. And I think that comes across incredibly well in the voice of her essay here. So she's talking in this essay about how she was raised in a religious family, but then at some point turning 13, she decided that she did not believe in that religion anymore. And what I really love about this essay, Carrie, if you want to just keep advancing the rest of the paragraphs, one of the things that I really loved about this essay is that she talks about the specific experience of attending a Catholic youth camp where she felt incredibly uncomfortable and also felt very stubborn in her own belief to the point where she wasn't willing to open up or listen to other people's opinions or thoughts. And what she discovered at this Catholic youth camp was a priest who was willing to listen to her story and not ask her to change her mind and not ask her to have a call to action to explore faith or anything like that. And that interaction completely changed her approach to different ideas, different conversations, different beliefs, and things like that. So where Lily gets to throughout the course of this essay is from being really stubborn in her belief and not believing in religion to getting to this very introspective place where she's asking questions of herself. Am I living aimlessly? Do I have a purpose? What was I so paralyzed by questioning the past and the future that I'm missing out on the present? And where she gets to by the end of this essay is that she's very intrigued to continue these types of conversations and that this moment made her a much more open-minded person. And that's exactly the sort of thing that a liberal arts college wants from their students, right? You want someone who's open-minded, who's thinking critically, who wants to debate different topics. And so it aligns super, super well with the type of school she's applying to as well.
Thank you, Olivia. So I think that one closes out Lily, but to make sure I am recapping this for the listeners that may be popping in and out, I think what was really beneficial about listening to the Lily conversation was understanding the combination of the academics, the personality of the college. Should she go ED Tufts? Should she go ED Middlebury? Which one was really the right fit for her? And additionally, in a test optional landscape, like, it was necessary for Lily to understand which school she should be sending test scores to and which schools she shouldn't. And I think that was like really pivotal to her success and her acceptance into those schools. And I think at the end of this, we talked more about narrative, and it sounds like Lily really had an incredibly strong narrative that Olivia was able to identify is even stronger when you're presenting it to a liberal arts institution and an academic office within that. I can tell you from my personal experience when I worked at Colorado College, which is actually how I met Olivia. And my personal experience, we read some of the most amazing essays in the world at these liberal arts colleges. And I think about this sometimes. My favorite essay I've ever read was about a student that ate a bacon sandwich, and I will never forget it. It was like the most basic topic, and it was amazing. And so, Olivia was able to explore this topic with her student that was actually much less basic, but it was still a really introspective, reflective version. So thank you so much, Olivia, for that. And Marjorie, we're moving on to Aurelia at the University of Richmond.
Great, thank you. I think maybe I'll pick up on a thread that was introduced by our previous student with respect to test optional admissions, which really has been somewhat game changing, as you can imagine, in the past couple of years. And Aurelia is a student where, I just feel so happy that we're living through this time where the landscape is changing a little bit to provide some more flexibility and opportunity for students. There's another way in which I think we could talk about test optional admissions and be frank about the tremendous benefits to the institutions themselves, which have seen an incredible increase in the volume of their applications as a result of test optional admissions. But that's another conversation. But as to the benefits for the student, Aurelia really was one of those students who we were just able to meet the moment, and she benefited significantly from test optional admissions. As you can see from just some of the information that we provided here, she was a student in honors classes from grade 9 all the way through her high school career, and started to take on AP courses, 1 in 10th, 1 in 11th, and then 3 in 12th grade, which is a very solid course selection for this very high performing high school. Again, mostly an A minus student with just an occasional B or B plus. But thinking about this transcript in the context of her school, if you don't mind just advancing the slides, this school presents its information in a different manner. It doesn't offer colleges any signposts with respect to where a student falls in the class, and many high schools do not. They don't rank, they don't provide a decile rank. They will, however, provide at-a-glance information about the depth of the curriculum, whether it's an AP curriculum or an IB curriculum or something else entirely. So this is a school offering quite a deep bench of AP courses. And again, Aurelia has taken advantage of a good number of them, but there will be students competing for admission who have taken even more APs than she has been able to access in her school. And then when you start to look carefully at her grades, oops, sorry, can you go back for me? Thank you. Compared to the grading scale at the school, her overall GPA was around somewhere between 3.75 and 3.8. So you can see where that ends up mapping out here on the grading scale. And you can imagine, there are quite a number of students who are going to have GPAs that are higher, and then, obviously some that are lower. And our role really was to help Aurelia to think about building a college list where she would have appropriate reach schools, but also to think carefully about what to do with regard to standardized testing, because this was a student where the standardized testing just wasn't anywhere nearly as strong, I should say, as her academic credentials as presented in her transcript. So whereas with Lily, the student we were just looking at, there was conversation on a school by school basis, your scores will be additive here, maybe not so much there. For Aurelia, by and large, she was a test optional applicant everywhere. And that ended up being very successful for her. If you don't mind now advancing to the next slide, I'll just talk a little bit about sort of the background and approach to Aurelia's college list. Aurelia was a student who had two older siblings, both of whom had attended the same college. She also was a student who found herself involved in extracurricular activities that were somewhat familiar, and I'll circle back to this when we talk about her essay in a moment. But one of the things that really set her apart, both within her family and within her school community and as an applicant, was her interest in art. So one of the APs that you saw in the previous slide was actually an AP art class that she was able to take in 10th grade. And she maintained art electives all throughout high school. And if you don't mind advancing to the next slide, I thought I would just take a moment here to go a little bit more in detail with regard to extracurricular activities. Again, thinking about your own children. Oops, can you go back possibly, Carrie, so we can see those extra, there, perfect, that's perfect. Just to say a word or two about some of the work that can be ongoing in the summer before senior year, in addition to suggesting that students start to inventory some of their activities and try to recall some of the details around things that have been important or meaningful throughout their lives in high school outside of the classroom. We also spend some time strategically taking advantage of, simply stated, the 150 characters available to us for every single activity. So we mentioned earlier that there is opportunity to report 10 activities on the Common Application platform. And for each of them, in addition to the name of the activity and any kind of leadership role that you might want to report, you then have 150 characters available to you to elaborate and explain, what exactly was I up to with regard to this activity. So here, with regard to student artist, we took this as an opportunity to just call out that this student had been a student of AP art history, and art electives throughout high school. Her artwork was selected for display in a local storefront. And then similarly, you can see how we came up with verbiage to help articulate her interest in a girls STEM program, GSTEM basically. And this is, just some of the ongoing work that we do over the course of time between junior year and senior year. So this gives you a sense of what this student was interested in. And then if you don't mind going to the next slide, please. Thank you. So again, she used the prompt that we were looking at earlier this evening, talking about a background, identity, interest, or talent. And I don't want you to be concerned that we had our student write an entire essay about skateboarding, which had become a passion for Aurelia in the pandemic. However, in talking with her about skateboarding, she told a great story about finding an old skateboard in the garage and having this exchange with her dad. And this became the beginning of a larger conversation around, I'll call it, birth order, what it meant to be the youngest of three daughters, how she felt about the genesis and evolution of some of her own interests as a young person whose interests were inextricably tied to the influence of family members whom she loved dearly, but also, someone who was emerging as a young woman in search of her own identity. And so her thesis, if you will, became, as the youngest member of an enormous family, providing some real color around the enormity and complexity of the family here, I find that my passions are shared. However, I've been going through this process that has been important to me in growing up, learning that I share experiences with my family, but I'm finding my own way to stand out. And rather than belabor the skateboard, because it would be hard to write 650 words about skateboarding for this student who was not an expert skateboarder, but it just had become a pastime in the pandemic. Rather, we took this theme, and now if you don't mind just letting the other paragraphs cycle in, we use this theme to then illuminate other aspects of her extracurricular activity list, if you will, which is to say other interests and other important dimensions of her life, including the high jump, where she had actually been pretty successful and felt proud that this was actually something that nobody on either side of her parents' families had ever played. And also then, spent some time on her passion for art and really allowed her to find some language that we thought would be really just memorable, frankly. Surrounded by watercolors, I forgot my mom's guiding influence and fell in love. So again, just a little bit of insight into how we invite students into conversation about things that we hope are just genuinely important to them and really make them the special individuals that they are, and then help them to convey that to a stranger who's going to evaluate their application on the other side of the transaction. If we can now go to the next slide, I'll just say a few words about the development of Aurelia's list. I mentioned she's the youngest of three. Both siblings had gone to, and one was actually enrolled at Villanova. And when I first met this family, I think it was almost a foregone conclusion that, you know, maybe Aurelia was going to apply ED to Villanova. And actually, in the end, she applies early action. But I left this here just so that you could see the extent to which we were really focusing on Villanova, and then also identifying some other schools for early action to ensure she had some good options and some good news coming in, even if she ended up deferred from Villanova. Initially, there was a lot of conversation around geographic radius and not wanting to go too far. But there was just something about my connection with this student and her mom. In this case, it was really most of my communication was with her mom and obviously with Aurelia herself, where I ended up suggesting University of Richmond. And initially, I think they felt it was too far. And then as time drew on, and they visited actually quite a few schools in Pennsylvania, but it was just like the shoe wasn't fitting and she wasn't feeling wholeheartedly committed to Villanova. And again, wanted a little bit to go her own way, just coming back to the theme that we ended up developing in the essay. In the pandemic, mom and daughter drove to University of Richmond, were completely enchanted, really fell in love, did some additional research upon their return, and in the end, really felt excited to apply early decision to Richmond. And again, because of the opportunity to apply test optional, it worked out. And this was one of those instances where, you know, we just could not have felt more excited or celebratory about this outcome, because as you'll recall from the earlier slides, she was a great student in a great high school, earning mostly A's in a very good program. But had there not been that test optional disruption in the admissions landscape, I'm not sure University of Richmond would have been an option for this student. So, you know, this was a really happy outcome. And I think that's it for Aurelia. So we can move on to the next student.
Thank you, Marjorie. A couple of things that Marjorie said that stuck out to me. One of them, side note, my own personal story here is when I applied to college, I wrote an essay on my toes. So, I mean, it's like very odd, very silly, very basic. But arguably, I think the strongest narrative for every student is one that they feel they can write about and they can talk about. And so in this specific situation, Marjorie's student wrote about skateboarding, and it was like an amazing way to start highlighting everything else that was so important about her and her, you know, this illumination of her personal attributes from the ground up was really beautiful. And so Marjorie wanted to point that out, and also shout out to my own high school self for writing an essay on my toes. Feeling great about that. I actually should find that. I've got it somewhere. And then the other thing I really wanted to point out about Marjorie's her last student, Aurelia, is that there was a lot of trust in that relationship. And I think I really strongly want to point this out, because I think if Aurelia and Marjorie were not as close as they were, and so kudos Marjorie over here, I doubt Aurelia would have been willing to take that drive down to a school that she'd probably never heard of, but that was amazing. It just like was out of her range, and fell in love with it. And so arguably in this sense, I really think that this relationship and this suggestion of Richmond, which she's now at and thriving, has quite literally changed the trajectory of her higher education experience. So thank you so much for that, Marjorie. Olivia, our last student here, let's talk about Peter Parker at the University of Michigan. Take us away.
Wonderful. Okay, so Peter Parker, obviously not his real name. I'm sure plenty of you have seen the new Spider-Man movie. So Peter Parker, let's talk about who he is. He is also a Brazilian student. He also has a dual citizenship with a European country as well. So he has both South American and European heritage. He attended a private school in Brazil, which was a Brazilian high school rather than an international school, which does kind of become important as you talk about international admissions, attending an international high school as opposed to a school that uses the local country's or region's format of classes and grades and things like that. So that's something we'll keep talking about. As we talk about his academic strengths, so he has a very strong GPA, particularly as you think about in the Brazilian system. It is very, very common for high schools to just overload their students with so much work. So being able to get mostly 9s or high 8s out of 10 is very, very strong for a Brazilian high school. He was ranked in the top 6% of his school class, which is huge for him. But even despite these really strong academic indicators, he still is lacking just a little bit of that connection that an international high school can sometimes give you if you are growing up outside the US, because the curriculum is more familiar to colleges here in the US. The grading systems are more familiar. They're more comparable to what admission counselors are used to seeing. So super strong student doesn't necessarily have that extra boost that he might need from an international school. But he also has really strong standardized testing, which is wonderful. This was a student where we submitted his SAT scores to every school to which he applied, including both his 1480 SAT and his 800 and his 770 in the math level 2. He also earned a 103 in his TOEFL, so he had a pretty strong English language skill as well. What really, really wowed me about Peter when I first met him was his extracurricular activities, particularly for a student not coming from an international school background. You usually just don't have as much access to extracurricular activities and different things in order to build a resume for yourself. So he was able to sort of create a lot of these things and create his own projects to really fill out his activities list. So he co-founded an entrepreneurship league at his high school. He co-founded with his uncle an NGO, non-governmental organization, to raise money for a group of people that have the same condition that his uncle has. So he is, creating his own nonprofit. He participated in investment competitions, investment clubs, different kinds of entrepreneurship experiences. And on top of that, he participates in martial arts, he plays musical instruments, and he even tutored fellow students in his 10th grade year in math and physics. So this student is very, very interested in STEM, in business, in math, in economics, and his extracurricular list absolutely demonstrates that, along with some other interests that don't have anything to do with economics or business, but that add extra flavor to his activities. So moving on, some of the things that he's really looking for: a top US college for business or economics. That was the number one thing that Peter came into our meeting saying this is what he wanted. He also was really attracted to the large university environment and wanted a big campus with big energy and athletic programs and that sort of traditional US college experience that you see in the movies. But more than anything else, he wanted a school that he couldn't say no to. That was the thing that he kept saying to me, is I want a place where I won't have to think twice about attending. And so naturally, through those conversations, the University of Michigan came to mind to me as a place that would offer him an excellent opportunity in either business or economics, along with the large university, the athletic programs, and the name recognition that a lot of our international students are looking for. So some of the key conversations that Peter and I had together were talking about his college list a lot of times. So when we build a college list, we try to break it into categories for reach schools, target schools, and likely schools. The reach schools are schools that you are not super likely to get into, but you have a shot at. That, if the cards fall just right, and your strategy works out, you might get a chance to get into that school. A target school is where your profile lines up pretty well with the average student, so you've got a pretty good chance of acceptance there, although it's not necessarily a guarantee. A likely school is, as the name implies, much more likely a chance for acceptance. And we try to help students find a balance between all of those things. And particularly for Peter, because it was so important for him to reach for the stars and find a school that he couldn't say no to, he had a hard time including some target and likely schools on his list. So that was an important conversation that we had around including at least 1 to 2 target or likely schools, along with his list of 8 to 10 reaches that he really wanted to, go for the gusto for them. On top of that, we also talked about the benefits of applying for an economics program versus a business program, because he was interested in both. And they tend to fall within different parts of the university, especially when you're looking at large universities. Your College of Business is completely separate from your College of Arts and Sciences, which is typically where you'll find an economics program. So we talked a lot about that strategy of whether economics or business was the right fit. In terms of talking about his essay, he used the same exact prompt as Lily did, but he went a completely different direction. And I actually had to fight for this essay because his parents wanted him to use a different essay that was about him co-founding the institute that he's running for fundraising for medical conditions. But this essay had so much voice and so much passion and so much dynamism to it that I could not let it go. Because this essay is all about him sort of finding his voice as a young person. So it's immediately in the moment. Everything is present tense. So you're immediately thrown into this moment where he is selected to moderate a debate at his high school for 3 local candidates that are running for the national parliament. He's 14 years old at the time. So this happened during his 9th grade year. And he really intersperses little tidbits about himself as well. He likes to play Beatles songs. He likes to do puzzles. He is also a student who's always asking questions, who always wants to know the why behind things. So in the middle of this really interesting dynamic scenario, he's also inserting little tidbits about who he is as a person, which is something I love. And then you get this actual moment of dialogue where he's talking to the incumbent representative. He's asking about, some of these things that you've done, just because they're legal, are they ethical? Should you be doing them? And it's this incredible moment of him talking back to a grown adult who is an elected representative in his country. And it's a moment that helps him really realize the importance of using his voice, the importance of protesting, the importance of learning, of continuing to grow his thought process and to continue to debate people. And so this moment was a really wonderful place for him to talk a lot about the importance of ethics, the importance of questioning authority, and the importance of leadership. And all of those things are so important for someone who is considering a career as an economist or as a business person.
All right. Thank you so much, Olivia. And again, thank you, Marjorie and Olivia, for all of this and all of these cases. I think for Olivia's, and I'll give some takeaways from this, that what I was really hearing from this is Peter started early, which I want to talk about in a second. And he really had the individual excitement. He had the leadership. He took off when he was younger. And it's so clear from his essay and from his background that he was able to do that. And it really helped him and Olivia together strategize about how to best present himself. And I think his early investment really allowed himself to understand how to also present himself as an economics major, rather than maybe straight business at Michigan, to give him a really better interpretation and well-rounded education at the LSA school. All right, so some takeaways from this in general. Thank you all for being here. I think the first one, thank you to Marjorie for saying this a couple times, like enrolling in the right school can be life-changing. And I believe that from my own college experience. I enrolled at a school called Carleton College, changed my world. I would do it 1,000 times again, small private liberal arts school. And for one of Marjorie's students, I think University of Richmond was a really life-changing experience. And really being there and having the ability to try something new and now thriving in that environment is just huge. So we want you to start early. I mean this very seriously. If you are a 10th or 11th grader listening to this, I think it's really, really important, or 9th grader, that your investment now reduces your stress later. And it also allows you time for a greater exploration in order to find the right fit. And like Olivia's student, who is now at the University of Michigan, if you do start earlier, you're able to strategize more. And it's not only less stressful, but it's really a stronger application over time. And the industry is in flux, as we've talked about, with the test optional early decision, restrictive early action at Georgetown. Like there's currently a court case about decreasing the size of a California incoming class. And there's video interviews. Oh my gosh, do we do them? Like what's next? And I think it's so helpful to have, again, a professional working with you to say, here's what the industry is. It is in flux. Also, I talk to parents sometimes and I'm like, I'm a huge nerd. I read all these like New York Times articles and other things and Chronicle of Higher Ed. And so all of us are able to share those stories with you and teach you how the industry is moving. And then last, really identifying and illuminating the personal attributes truly, I believe, is the number one goal. And you are able to see that from the narrative across all 4 of these applicants. Their stories are so strong, even if it's not this wildly crazy story that you've never heard of. I think the skateboarding one is a really perfect example of a wonderful essay, so strong, and it's about a really simple topic. And so keep that in mind as you're working through this and you're thinking through the application process. All right, so that was our whole presentation. I thank so much Olivia and Marjorie for sharing all of these cases, all 4 of them with us. We are here for questions and we'll stay a couple minutes. I know there was a few on the chat, so I'll read those out loud. And for those of you who are heading out now, thank you so much for coming. Feel free to reach out anytime. We've got our contact@LogicPrep email. My name is Carrie, and I can drop my email in the chat as well as the director here. So you can always reach out to me at any point. And we're so excited to chat with you about achieving your future goals. And my dog is sneezing in the background, so that was a aside. But here we are. Thank you so much. All right. I think, Marjorie, I'm going to present a question to you, actually, that was in the chat. The question was, how much does your high school factor into the college decision? So meaning if you're at a small school that doesn't have many students going to college, how does this factor into the college's read of your application?
Thank you, Carrie. That's a great question. One way to answer the question would be to say that ideally, it really shouldn't matter. I do believe that colleges really try to neutralize, I'll say, the advantage or disadvantage of attending a particular school. And what I mean by that is that college admission evaluators either are seasoned and quite familiar with the landscape of a particular region. You might remember from the very beginning, I mentioned my particular experience was, an admission office organized by region. So oftentimes admission evaluators are very familiar with the course offerings, the grading scale, et cetera. And if they aren't, it really is their responsibility to refer to this documentation that is referred to as the school profile, which is documentation that not very many parents or students see or are familiar with until
it's so useful to college admissions.
late junior year or even early senior year. And I would say, for those of you in the US, and I do realize in Brazil, this is a different conversation for each and every school environment, but we can help you to navigate that for your school environment wherever you are. But certainly in the United States, it's a very reasonable question to ask or to search your school's website for my high school profile. Can I see the high school profile? That really is how your school district or your high school is presenting its face publicly to colleges and providing a roadmap for colleges to interpret the transcript and to understand what does it mean to take a rigorous course load or a rigorous program in this school as compared to neighboring schools in this particular region. So there are tools available, and best practice really is for college admission evaluators to take the time to familiarize themselves with the context of each and every school and to make sure that applications are being given what I would refer to as a fair, ethical read within the context of the high school. And really, we haven't talked that much about holistic admissions, generally speaking, but everything we're talking about here in the landscape of selective college admissions really is holistic admissions, whereby college admission evaluators are looking at academic credentials and the more subjective factors that we talked about tonight. And they are supposed to be reading applications within the context of the school. The caveat to this, and I'm sorry, this is a long answer, is that, where it becomes less than ideal is that you do sometimes have school environments, and here I'm going to say, it can be for better or for worse. So you do have school environments where sometimes a school counselor might have a relationship with an admission dean or admission evaluator from a particular college, and that school counselor, the high school counselor, not us, the high school counselor might be trying to leverage his or her relationship with the college admissions representative to advocate strongly for his or her kids that year. That can happen, and that can influence outcomes marginally on the periphery. It's not really kind of day in, day out how decisions are made. But when I say for better or for worse, that would sort of be, for better if you're at that school, and for worse if you're not at that school. Also, what can happen, just, again, looking at this in a few different ways, is that students really are competing with their high school counterparts primarily. Although obviously it's a national and an international competition at some level, most immediately, these decisions are being made within school groups. And at the end of the day, admission evaluators, admission offices are interested to a certain extent. It's not a perfect art, but they are interested in sending a coherent set of decisions back to a high school. So if you're at a high school that isn't really a pipeline to a particular college, that can actually be advantageous, because the good news is there might not be very many seniors applying to the particular selective college that you're interested in. And so there's not this universe of comparison immediately available to the evaluator, where the evaluator might want to admit you, but then needs to take into account, well, what happened to the 7 kids with GPAs higher than yours and the 2 kids with GPAs lower than yours? All of this sort of reconciliation that happens toward the end of the process. If you're applying from a high school that isn't really a known quantity to a college, that actually can work for you because the college might be interested in opening up a new pipeline. Oh, this is interesting. We don't really typically get applications from this particular school. Who knows what might come next if we offer admission to this great kid, and this great kid actually comes to our college. Maybe next year, we'll see an increase in the number of applications because we've got this great ambassador now going back to his or her hometown and saying like, hey, I really am happy at this school. So I hope that answers the question, which is to say, there are tools to neutralize it, but obviously we don't live in the ideal world, we live in the real world. And these are some of the other ways that whether or not your school is on the map for a particular college can also become part of the equation, so to speak. I hope that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Marjorie. And just to remind everyone, Olivia actually presented one of these students, a very, very strong student who is from a I think, was it, Olivia, correct me if I'm wrong, was it an IB curriculum? It was not.
No, the Brazilian
Right?
school,
okay.
no.
Yes, it was a traditional non-IB, non-American, non-UK curriculum. And so that is a really interesting example of a school that probably did not send a lot of students to University of Michigan in the past. And so this student quite literally blazed a path, and it worked, which is really exciting. And now my guess, at least, is University of Michigan will now actually see the name of that high school and look at those next students in future years with a little bit more interest, because those students are now more likely to attend if they admit them. So fun side note. All right, next question. We have 2 questions that are actually quite similar. And Olivia, I'm gonna have you answer this one. Marjorie, feel free to chime in at any point. They're about reach schools and dream schools and all of that. And of course, here we want you to be dreaming. So the question is, how do we at LP help students decide on the college list? How high should a student dream? And one question is, how many reach schools should we be applying for? So Olivia, you want to take that one away?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as with everything in college admissions, the answer is always, it depends. If any of you are working with a college advisor, whether it's a LogicPrep advisor, a high school counselor, whoever, you're going to hear it depends all the time. But the main kind of way to answer this question is that it's going to depend a lot mostly on your goals. What are your goals for your college experience? Like, for example, the Peter Parker student that I shared, his primary goal was to attend a top university. That was his goal. That's something he'd been working toward for years when we first met, and it was something that was driving him immensely. So that student had almost entirely reach schools on his list because that's what he was focused on. Even a variety of reach schools that I genuinely did not think he had a shot at actually getting accepted to. But for him, it was so important to at least take the chance and at least try. And so that was something that we worked on together, was making sure that, yes, you can apply to these schools. I'm happy to tell you that I don't think it's worth your time to apply to these schools. But if it's important to you, let's do it. Let's put our best foot forward and throw it out there and see what happens. And so the conversation that I had with him was about trying to rein it in, at least on a couple of colleges, to focus on some more of these really wonderful colleges that maybe haven't made a top 10 or top 20 list in business or economics, but are still excellent schools and have wonderful programs that he could get involved with. And University of Michigan ended up being right in that sweet spot for him, where it was a reach, but it was a reasonable reach, and it made sense for him as a student, and it made sense for his goals, and it made sense for the type of college that I thought and that he thought would be the best fit for him. So the number of reaches that you include on a list can completely depend on the type of student. My student Lily, the other student that I shared, she only had probably 4 or 5 reaches on her list, and the rest of her colleges were in the target or likely range. So she had a much more what I would call a balanced list, in that she had a few reaches, a few targets, a few likelies. And that's typically what we aim for students that are not aiming just for the high end of schools, if that makes sense. So it depends a lot on what you want to get out of that process and what kind of goals you're coming in with. But what we try to do is just be very honest upfront with where we think you could land based on your grades, based on the school that you attend, based on your test scores, based on your intended major or intended career path. All of those things impact your ability to get accepted to specific schools. So we try to work within that context to help you develop the best list that's going to give you options at the end of the day.
Thanks, Olivia. Yeah, I totally hear and agree. And I'm trying to summarize this a little bit because it was a longer answer. We want you, I think that one of the answers is so nuanced, because we want you to dream. We want you to reach. We want you to seek big. That's so important. We also want to meet you where you are. And so some students really want to reach big, and some students really want to feel a little bit more comfortable. And there's nothing wrong with either of those situations. In fact, we really work well with trying to motivate you in my dog agrees, in trying to motivate you with whatever situation that you are seeking. And so if you want to shoot big, let's go. Let's build momentum. Let's motivate. Awesome. We also want to ground you in what could be possible, and the high risk part of that situation. And additionally, if you want to kind of be a little bit more strategic, let's do it, and we are here to meet you where you need to be bent and help you. And so the way we craft a college list is usually to start with, here's a good mix, but what are your thoughts? What are your goals? What are your dreams? And how can we move off of that? I am realizing we are 14 minutes over, so I have to close this down. We have one more question, which is, did Peter Parker apply early decision to any of his reach options? And Olivia, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so we can talk a little bit about his process. So he did end up applying early decision to University of Pennsylvania, not to the Wharton College of Business, but to the College of Arts and Sciences as an economics student, which was another strategic decision that we made. That was a very strong reach for him, particularly given how popular University of Pennsylvania is for Brazilian applicants in particular, and Brazilian business applicants and economics applicants. So it was definitely a large reach for him. He was not accepted ultimately to University of Pennsylvania, but he did apply early action to University of Michigan, which I think very much helped him in that process of getting his acceptance to Michigan.
Thank you, Olivia. All right, everyone. Thank you. I think this was really wonderful question and answer participation. And so I'm really grateful. And Olivia and Marjorie, thank you so much. Olivia and Marjorie students, thank you so much if you're out there. And really, truly, we are here to help. So reach out anytime. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.